In September 2023, Ethiopia announced it had completed the final filling of its Grand Renaissance Dam on the Nile. At $4 billion, it is the largest hydropower project in Africa. For Addis Ababa, it's a triumph of sovereignty and survival. For Cairo, it's a looming existential threat. Egypt's president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi once warned that Egypt and Sudan together receive only 4% of the Nile Basin's annual 1,600 billion cubic meters of water. That line captured Cairo's fear, a sense that while the river is vast, their share is fragile. This story goes back more than a century. During the colonial era, Britain, acting in Egypt's interests, signed the 1929 Nile Waters Agreement. It gave Cairo the right to veto any projects upstream that might reduce the flow of the river. Ethiopia and the other upper riparian states weren't consulted. 30 years later, in 1959, Egypt and Sudan signed another treaty between themselves, dividing the river's flow almost entirely between the two countries, with Egypt taking 55.5 billion cubic meters per year, and Sudan 18.5 billion. Everyone else was left out. For Egypt, these treaties were a guarantee of life. Nearly all Egyptians live along the Nile, in the narrow strip of green land that cuts through the desert. With more than 100 million people to feed, the river is not just a resource, it is the country's bloodstream. Even a 2% cut, Egypt's own water ministry warned, could destroy farmland and put at stake the survival of 1 million people. For Ethiopia, the story runs in reverse. The Nile's blue tributary rises in its highlands, providing about 85% of the water that eventually reaches Egypt. Yet for decades, Ethiopia remained poor, unstable, and powerless to tap the river that flowed from its own mountains. By 2023, only 55% of Ethiopians had access to electricity. Nearly half the population still lived in the dark. Women and children in rural areas spent hours each day collecting firewood for cooking, while factories stood idle without reliable power. The Grand Renaissance Dam is meant to change that. When fully operational, it will produce more than 5,000 megawatts, doubling Ethiopia's electricity supply and allowing it to export power across East Africa. For Ethiopia, it's not just an energy project. It's a promise to light homes, power industries, and transform a nation. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has called it a second Adwa, invoking Ethiopia's famous victory over colonial Italy in 1896. The comparison is deliberate. Adwa symbolized independence, dignity, and resistance to foreign pressure. By framing the GERD in those terms, Abiy turned the dam into a monument of sovereignty. Abiy reminded the world in 2025 that the GERD was entirely financed by Ethiopians themselves through bonds, donations, and domestic resources. Not a dollar came from the World Bank or Western donors. That made the project a matter of pride and a defiant rejection of dependency. When he invited Egypt and Sudan to attend its inauguration, it was both an olive branch and a message. The GERD is here to stay. But in Cairo, few see it that way. Egypt's leaders insist that an upstream dam controlled by Ethiopia could strangle the river at its source. Their fear is not theoretical. In 2018, Egypt's own report to the United Nations warned that if Ethiopia filled the GERD reservoir too quickly, Lake Nasser behind the Aswan High Dam could lose 92 billion cubic meters of water. The economic cost, more than $4 billion in lost hydropower. Egypt's media echoes the same theme. The Nile is life or death. With the river providing 90% of the country's fresh water, even a temporary reduction could devastate farms, kill jobs, and destabilize society. Cotton, Egypt's most famous crop, is especially water-intensive. Without the river, entire livelihoods would collapse. Caught between Ethiopia's pride and Egypt's fear is Sudan. For Khartoum, the GERD offers both opportunity and risk. On one hand, the dam could regulate the Nile's seasonal flows, preventing the devastating floods that have hit Sudanese farms in the past. It could also provide access to cheap Ethiopian electricity. On the other hand, Sudan worries that mismanagement could disrupt its own dams and water stations or leave it vulnerable during drought years. For years, Sudan oscillated between cooperation with Ethiopia and solidarity with Egypt. But since its recent political turmoil, its ability to influence events has weakened. Inside Ethiopia, the GERD has not come without cost. The dam's construction displaced indigenous Gumus and other minority communities in the Benishangul Gumuz region. Human rights groups note that locals lost land and livelihoods as the massive reservoir expanded. For many, the project has been celebrated as a national dream, but at the local level, it has meant sacrifice. Diplomatically, the dispute has followed a cycle: talks, stalemate, crisis. In June 2021, Arab League ministers meeting in Doha declared that Egypt and Sudan's water security was an integral part of Arab national security. They called on the UN Security Council to intervene. A day later, Ethiopia rejected the resolution, insisting that the Nile was also an existential issue for Ethiopia, tied to lifting millions out of poverty. That same year, the UN Security Council issued a rare presidential statement. It encouraged Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia to reach a mutually acceptable and binding agreement under African Union mediation, but it also stressed that this case should not set a precedent for other water disputes. Since 2020, the African Union has led negotiations under the motto of African solutions to African problems. But years later, no binding agreement has been reached. Talks continue to break down over technical questions: how fast Ethiopia should fill the reservoir, how the dam should be managed during droughts, and how disputes should be resolved. Meanwhile, global powers have circled the dispute. China has played a major role in Ethiopia's development. It financed more than $1 billion in transmission lines to connect the GERD to the national grid, and its companies helped build much of the dam's infrastructure. Yet politically, analysts describe China's role as everywhere and nowhere, deeply invested but reluctant to pressure either side. The United States, too, has been entangled. During his presidency, Donald Trump tried to broker a deal, leaning heavily toward Egypt's position. At one point, he remarked that Egypt might blow up the dam, a comment that horrified Ethiopians. In 2025, when Trump claimed that the GERD had been financed with American money, Ethiopian officials publicly denied it. At the same time, Trump ramped up his campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize, casting himself as a global peacemaker. For many in Addis Ababa, his involvement felt less like mediation and more like meddling. The GERD has also become a stage for broader rivalries. The Arab League has backed Egypt, framing the dam as a regional security issue. The African Union insists on keeping it within Africa. The European Union has urged compromise. The United Nations has encouraged talks but refused to take sides. For Ethiopia, internationalization feels like interference. For Egypt, it is a way to pressure Addis Ababa into concessions. So what comes next? Analysts outline several possibilities. One is a prolonged stalemate. Ethiopia continues to fill and operate the dam cautiously, while Egypt continues to object. Both sides adapt to a tense status quo. This may already be happening. As the reservoir fills, Ethiopia begins generating power, and Egypt, despite its fiery rhetoric, avoids open confrontation. Time, in this scenario, favors Ethiopia. Another possibility is a breakthrough deal. Under pressure from the African Union, the United States, or other mediators, the parties could agree on rules for drought years, minimum flows, and dispute resolution. Egypt might formally recognize Ethiopia's right to operate the GERD in exchange for guarantees on water security. Ethiopia could sell surplus electricity to Sudan and Egypt, creating incentives for cooperation. This is the win-win scenario. A darker outcome is conflict. Egyptian officials have long hinted that all options are on the table. Military planners have studied the possibility of striking the dam, but any attack would be risky. Ethiopia has fortified the GERD with modern air defenses, and retaliation could spiral into regional war. Such a conflict would be catastrophic, destabilizing not only Ethiopia and Egypt, but the entire Horn of Africa and Red Sea corridor. Between stalemate and war lies the shadow of a regional Cold War. Already, Egypt has strengthened its ties with Sudan and Somalia, while Ethiopia has drawn closer to Somaliland and other partners. Instead of direct conflict, the two sides could compete through proxies, alliances, and economic pressure. Cyber attacks, propaganda wars, and political maneuvering could define the next phase. The Nile dispute is not only about water, it is about history, power, and identity. For Egypt, the river is its lifeline, the foundation of its civilization, and a symbol of continuity. For Ethiopia, the GERD is a break from dependency, a project of pride, and a step toward development. The Nile has nourished civilizations for thousands of years. Today, it is a test of whether two great nations can share its waters without plunging into conflict. Whether the river becomes a source of cooperation or confrontation will depend on choices made in the years ahead.